Now let's take a look at the RotoPaint node. I'm going to create a RotoPaint node by hitting P for paint. And you'll notice that it has additional tools compared to the Roto node. We have a paintbrush and eraser, clone and reveal, blur, sharpen, and smear, and dodge and burn. Let's look at each one. Paint tool will allow you to choose the color of the paint you want. So let's create a sort of a greenish color. And to adjust the diameter of the brush, you hold down Shift and drag left and right. You can also adjust it by middle clicking in this field and dragging. I like to do it interactively. If you have a tablet, you can control the hardness and this, or the size or the opacity via the pressure sensitivity of your tablet. I have a tablet here, so rather than using opacity, let's set it to size. And when you have the brush set to a certain diameter, this is the maximum size it can ever get, and then the pressure sensitivity will drive it to become or as large as the largest brush at its highest pressure. Hardness is the hardness of the brush. So at a hardness, lower hardness will actually create a softer looking brush, and a higher hardness will create a harder looking brush. Still has anti-aliasing, but it's quite hard looking. So I'm going to undo that, and let's use the tablet with pressure sensitivity and a little bit of pressure, and you can see I can control the thickness of the brush using pressure sensitivity. Now, something that may not be apparent with most of these tools is that you can also enable the ability to edit the shape. So in this case, I have selected the shape and used the Select All tool, and I'm going to make the actual shape points visible by using this control. So let's take this blobby shape that I got during my brush stroke that I might not be happy with. By just blowing away the points in the stroke, paint stroke that I created, I could smooth it out. So here's a way where you can combine very methodical editing of the shape and still create a procedural brush stroke, but it looks natural. So I'm hitting delete as I select these points. So these are splines just like any other spline, except for that they drive a paint stroke. So that's kind of a neat feature, and we'll use that in an exercise today to create a cool result. Let's keep moving down the list. The erase tool will erase the paint away back to the background behind it. Let's skip the clone tool for now. We'll look at it a little bit more in depth in a second. The blur tool will blur an image that's behind it. So it's a blur filter. So this is the size of the brush, but this is the amount of the blur right here. So if you want a stronger effect, I'm holding down middle mouse and dragging. This is less blur, so a small 2-pixel blur. Or if I want a very strong blur within this brush, I'm holding down Shift to drag the brush, and then clicking this will create about a 15-pixel blur in the shape of this brush as I go. So I'm Shift clicking here to delete these and hitting the minus button. Sharpen works similarly. You have the effect radius and you have the radius of the brush, which are two separate things. So I'm going to do a sharpen amount here and just sharpen by this effect amount. And the smear. And the smear is a little bit different in that the effect amount doesn't make any difference. It has to do with how far you drag. So the radius of the brush and how far you drag the effect in your stroke is what produces the smear effect. This is here only to, I guess, maintain compatibility with the nomenclature and the other types of brushes. 0. Doesn't make any difference at all. Still get a strong smear. Let's clear these all out. I'm selecting them all by shift-clicking and hitting right mouse button, delete. The burn and dodge tool. Dodge will lighten the image, and burn will darken the image, much like the burn and dodge tool in Photoshop. Whoa, that's really strong. Let's use a little less intensity. So I'm right-clicking here and dragging, or middle-clicking here and dragging to the left to reduce the strength of this effect. And now we're only burning by a weaker amount. Should have used the tablet for that. So let's circle back around to the clone tool. We've already experimented with it a little bit, but there's some functionality that's definitely worth knowing about. Just like the other tools, you hold down Shift, drag left and right to change the size of the brush. To choose the area you want to clone, you hold down Control and drag. The cursor with the cross in it is the area that you're picking paint up from, and the cursor, in this case to the right, is where you're dropping that paint. So this is how you can clone in space, but what about cloning in time? Because in this case, if I was to animate, or if this was to move, you would see a definite flickering of this paint fix, because I would maybe be copying a different texture over each frame unless I was very consistent about picking the same spot for the whole shot. So let's undo that. Control Z. In order to clone through time, what you need to do is, rather than cloning from the foreground, you clone from the background, and then you get an additional set of controls. So now it's picking, as we saw in the roto node, the background is the pristine incoming image. It's picking from the background, but you can choose when in time you would like to pick from the background. So you have the choice of relative, meaning there is an offset in time relative to the current frame. Right now I'm cloning from the same frame back to itself. But if I went positive, I'm cloning from the future. And if I went negative, I'm cloning from the past. Or you can clone absolute, which means you're picking from the same frame every single frame. In this case, I'm picking from frame 2. The meaning changes in this field. So it's either a delta or an absolute frame. So relative is usually the best strategy, because then if there's any grain or noise in the shot, you're cloning that over and it's alive rather than freezing on one frame. So let's use relative. In this case, I can see that the guy's moving the glass, and it seems like in about, let's say, one to four, let's say 4 frames in the future, there's a clean spot where the dot that I want to paint out was. So we'll go 4, relative 4 in the future. And I don't want any offset on my clone brush at all, so if I wanted to, I could set that here. I could reset it so I'm completely sure that I'm cloning from the same place to the same place with no translate offset. I got that by going to the gear. And I have rounding clicked on, which means that if there's any sub-pixel difference in my stroke, it will round it to the nearest pixel. If you're really paranoid, you can switch this to impulse, and then there's zero filtering at all. Which, if there's rounding, it shouldn't matter, but that will be no filtering. So now when I clone, I create a clone stroke. What I'm doing is I'm pulling from, in this case, if I'm on frame 1, I'd be pulling from frame 4 in the future. And if I go forward a frame, I'm pulling from frame 5 now, and so on. I hit my tablet by accident there. So let's see how this looks. Looks pretty okay. Did I miss a frame? No. So we're kind of pulling from a frame in the future. And last but not least, we have the reveal tool. And this is very similar to the clone tool, except for that by default it is meant to be used with an additional input. So we will use this input here, background 1, and we'll attach it to our RotoPaint node. And this one's very handy for when you have already prepared a clean plate or something like that. In this case, I'm just moving this plate forward in time to find a clean place. It's not ideal, but it gets the point across. So I can now clone, or not clone, but rather reveal BG1 through what I'm working on. It's pulling this input through and using the brush strokes to lay down little brush strokes of BG1. Ooh, that's terrible. All of the brush strokes have a lifetime, as we've already seen. You can control a range of frames, so you can go from start to a frame, all the frames, just a single frame, from this frame to the end, or a frame range, a given frame range. So you can do all kinds of combinations of brush strokes. If you're careful about how you manage your brush strokes, you really can be more frugal, especially when you're doing procedural clones and stuff. So it is useful to think about a sort of a brush stroke management strategy when you're going to be doing complex paints. And just like the roto shapes and roto layers, you can have layers of brush strokes as well. So oftentimes layers are a great way just to manage what you intend to use each set of brush strokes for, just to keep things organized. Just name them. Let's say like this, and then you kind of have a better sense of what you're doing. And also, all of the same transform rules apply to brush strokes as apply to the roto shape. So you can use that to procedurally drive a clone over time, for example. And I'll do an example of that for you here in the next video. But first, actually, let's use one more feature of the brush strokes that's very cool to do another project.